Yes.
Is that your WhatsApp, Nayantara, which is active in the background?
No.
Or is it mine? Okay, I'll just. So we already have live. Or, so looks like we are live. Are we good to go? Looks like it. So, hey everyone. I'm Jasmine, and I'm a volunteer at Fridays for Future, and I am here with another volunteer who's going to be speaking with us on World Environment Day about environment and philosophy, where it meets. So, first of all, happy Environment Day to all of you. And house rules: when our speaker is talking, if you have some questions, thoughts, and something to share, you can use the comment section, and I will be delivering it back to our speaker. So our speaker is Nayantara Suruguri, and she is an undergraduate student of philosophy and she's based in Mumbai. She is passionate about wildlife conservation and environmental awareness, and her interests have culminated into a profound curiosity for environmental ethics, which she wishes to explore and pursue. So we're glad on that. And when she is not engaging in philosophy or learning about wildlife, she likes to spend her time enjoying indie music and immersing herself in the beauty of nature. So it's our honor to have her here and speak to us about where environment and philosophy meets. So, floor is all yours, Nanda.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And happy Environment Day to all of you. So, before I begin, I would just like to mention that everything that I'm about to present is what I have studied as a part of my course. So, these are not my views necessarily. And I am not going to go much into detail about which is right and which is wrong, because that is something that I would like all of you to contemplate on and decide for yourself. So, and also everything that I'll be talking about is at a very basic level. And I would like you to treat this as an introduction to your world of, to the world of philosophy and environment. So, with that, let us begin. Topic is philosophy and the environment and where the two meet. So, when we're talking about this, we're essentially dealing with two concepts: philosophy and the environment. So, speaking of the environment first, I think most of you here, whether you're from FFF India or not, will have a good idea about what the environment means, or at least what it means to you, whether you define it as the natural world, the ecosystems, your surroundings, or the planet as a whole. But what is philosophy? What does philosophy mean and consist of? What is the first thing that comes into your mind when you think of the word philosophy? So, like, you can put that down in the chat, just the first word that comes into your mind when you think of philosophy. So, Jasmine, I would like to ask you, what comes into your mind?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, guys, please put in your comments. I just don't want to be the person talking here. But yeah, I think when we speak about philosophy, um, Gyan, wisdom comes into my mind, like way of life and things like that. That's That's what comes to my mind. A lot of
Mhm.
wisdom.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah. So you're actually quite spot on, because philosophy. So the etymology is of philosophy is actually the love philosophia, which means love for wisdom. So like gyan, wisdom. If you thought that, you're quite right. And you may think of Socrates, who was an ancient Greek
Yeah.
philosopher, who you can see on this, whose idol you can see on the screen here. Um, or you might have thought of it as a way of life, which it is actually. It is philosophy can also be like the way the attitudes and beliefs and all your views, and which influence the way you lead your life. So yeah, most of you are probably right about how you think of philosophy, because of how broad the field is and how many angles we can take towards philosophy. But to define
Yeah.
it in the most basic terms, philosophy is a field of study that deals with fundamental ideas, concepts, and nature of things. So the key word here is fundamental. So what we do is we go back to the basic ideas, to the fundamental ideas and concepts, and then we build theories around these fundamental ideas. For example, if a philosopher, when a philosopher asks the question, what is right? She not only means to ask, what do you think is the right thing to do? But also, what is right? Right? Like, what is rightness? What does it mean for something to be right? When is something right? So we go back to, maybe the meanings of words, we define the meanings of words, and then we build arguments around it, and these arguments then form theories, and that's how we have philosophy. um, so how such words, how such the meanings of such words and theories are formulated has far-reaching impacts on all other fields. So it works as a domino effect, right? So for example, the way I answer the question, what is right, the way I define what is right, will determine how I act in my daily life. Similarly, so many people will define what they mean by right, and that will determine how they act. And together, it will then determine the society in which they live in, or the culture to which they belong. And that in turn will determine their laws and governments and so on. So you can see how this works as a domino effect. It has far reaching implications on so many other fields, including the sciences and including the environment. Uh, for that, philosophy is known as the mother of all disciplines, or the mother of all sciences. So, how is philosophy practiced? I mean, what what do philosophers even do, or what do students of philosophy like me even do? So, like I said, philosophy is very, very broad and acts as an umbrella field towards all other areas of study. So there is no definite, absolute, universal method that all philosophers must use in order to philosophize. Uh, but if there is one thing that is common and crucial to philosophy, it is questions, questions, and more questions. So if you explore philosophy a little, you will realize that there are more questions than answers, right? So there are some questions to which philosophers or thinkers give their answers based on a few arguments, and then they build on these arguments and make theories to answer those questions. But again, there'll be more questions put on those theories, and so on, right? So there are so many questions around us. Um, and For example, so how you answer these questions, as these answers become more and more certain and solid, they actually become a part of another field altogether. So, for example, thousands of years ago, ancient philosophers and thinkers thought about questions like, what is the world made of? What am I made of? What is the air made of? And so on. And as they started answering these and started giving arguments for these, and as these answers started getting more and more certain and solid, they became a part of another field altogether, which we now known today we know that field as physics. So, but then at the same time, there are still questions that haven't been answered with so much certainty, right? Like, for example, do we have a soul? And is our soul immortal? And also, do animals have a soul? And what would that imply about how we treat them? And also, questions like what is right and what is wrong? So, for example, is lying wrong? And if it is wrong, then why is it wrong? So there are questions like these related to the environment that philosophy deals with. And two of these questions I will be asking you today. And I would like you to think about these questions and think about what your answers to them would be. And just keep coming back to these questions as we go ahead with the presentation. So the first question is, you live in a village next to the forest and there is a good population of feral dogs in your village. With time, their population grows and you realize that by going into the forest and killing birds and small animals, they are disturbing the ecosystem of the forest. In fact, there is an endangered bird found in the forest which is falling victim to these dogs. Now, you are someone who absolutely loves that forest and its biodiversity, and you realize that culling this feral dog population is the only solution to this problem. So, will you let a few dogs be killed for the sake of the entire forest and its overall ecosystem? Now, the second question, a hydroelectric project is proposed on a pristine river in the middle of a forest to provide power to nearby remote areas. This project will destroy thousands of trees and the overall ecosystem. So, does the forest need to be prioritized over the hydroelectric project? If yes, why do you think so? What is your reason? Is it because humans and non human organisms depend on these forests for their survival? Or is it because, regardless of that, forests are intrinsically or inherently valuable? So, what do you think? Think about these questions and how you would answer them.
Yes, and also, Nayantara, I think the connection dropped when you were, proposing the first question.
Hmm.
So definitely, these questions are, not just hypothetical questions, but real life situations happening in our country right now. And Fridays for Future is, looking at these various situations on how to fight for it and how to demand, solutions through these problems. So could you repeat the first question for our YouTube audience again?
Yeah, so like since the question is displayed in front of you, I'll just give you the gist. So there are, there's a good population of feral dogs in your village, which is next to a forest, and you realize that they are disturbing the ecosystem of the forest and even harming an endangered bird species. So you realize that the only solution is culling the feral dog population. There is no other solution. So will you let a few dogs be killed for the sake of the entire forest and its overall ecosystem? So that was the first question. So
Interesting.
yeah,
So
so
audience, please ponder on these questions. We will come back to that, right?
yes, we will come back to them
So, and
later.
you can use your comment section to share your thoughts. I'm watching that, and we can share it later on at the end. So yes, Nantara, go ahead.
Yes. So the branch of philosophy that deals with these kind of questions is known as environmental ethics. Now, environmental ethics deals with several topics, such as the rightness and wrongness of actions that affect the environment. Questions like, do non-human organisms have inherent value? Why is conservation important? Why should we even care about conserving species? Uh, it discusses socio-cultural perspectives towards the environment, which could mean, traditional philosophies and cultures of forest communities, or even religious perspectives towards the environment, and other problems like you have animal rights, forest rights, spirituality of nature, personal relationship with nature, and other related definitions. So that's basically what environmental ethics discusses. And under environmental ethics, there have been several lines of thought, of which I will be discussing a few. Now, again, I would just like to point out that this will be a very basic level discussion, and let this be an introduction to this topic for you so that you can explore this yourself as you wish. So that brings us to the historically most dominant line of thought towards the environment, which still persists today, and that is anthropocentrism. Now, anthropocentrism is made of two root words, anthropos, which is Greek for human, and center. So it's basically a human-centric philosophy towards the environment. So the basic tenet of this philosophy is that humans are at the center of the universe or the natural world, or as you can see in this image here, they are at the top of the universe, right? So the origin of anthropocentrism has been in Western schools of thought, right from the ancient Greeks, like Aristotle, who said that nature has made all things specifically for the sake of man. So,
Just to be clear here, Nayantara, can you explain like what is exactly like school of thought or school of thought? Like, what do you mean by that?
right. So, so when I said Western schools of thought, what does school of thought mean? So, schools of thought are basically, to put it very simply, perspectives or a group of theories, a group of philosophies that follow the same direction. So, for example, you have the Platonic school of thought, which is based on all the theories which are, based on the philosophy of Plato, who is an ancient Greek philosopher. So you have the Platonic school of thought, and in India, you have the Vedantic school of thought, which is based on the philosophy of all Vedantic thinkers. So these are basically what schools of thought are.
Okay.
Moving on, so there have been several historically influential movements and revolutions in human society, which have been, directly not inspired, but they have been rooted in anthropocentrism. For example, the Industrial Revolution and the capitalist economic system. So both of these systems are based on anthropocentric principles, which say that the value of the natural resources or even living beings is dependent on the utility of these elements to humans, right? So this sort of led to many of the environmental problems that we face even today. Um, and this is something that is a cause of concern for a lot of environmentalists. So these, societal movements or moments were actually based on the anthropocentric principles. Now, but at the same time, anthropocentrism is not necessarily destructive. So, if you notice, in fact, not most, but many environmentalists even today are in some way anthropocentric in their beliefs. Um, how exactly? So, for example, if you see some arguments related to climate action, people will say, okay, you need to be involved in climate action because you need to make this planet habitable for your children or your future generations. Similarly, you have trees. Trees are valuable because of their carbon sequestration services on which our survival depends. Our human survival depends on this, and that is why it is important to save trees. So, this form of anthropocentrism is known as prudential or enlightened anthropocentrism, also known as anthropocentric environmentalism, which says that, it anthropocentrism and environmentalism are compatible. So all of these appeal to the human factor of the picture, and it needs to be given value, given recognition because of its practical value. It's always easier to convince people to care about the environment when they are convinced that their life depends on it. Having said that, it is also true that anthropocentrism must not be left unchecked or unchallenged, because it does have a few root principles that are highly problematic in nature. And one of the most problematic of these is the concept of human superiority, right? That humans are at the top of the of the natural world, right? So human superiority here does not they do not mean human superiority in the not only in the scientific or literal sense, but also in the moral sense, right? So that means there's a moral decision to be made, as in something, when we are determining whether something is right or wrong, then the moral interests of the humans would be prioritized over the moral interests of all other animals or all other aspects of nature, right? So that is the main point here. Moral superiority of humans is the underlying concept. So
So,
in
uh, is it in the scientific sense?
yeah
What does
no
exactly human superiority mean? Is it in the
yeah so
scientific
like I
sense?
said it's not in the scientific sense at all. In this case, under anthropocentrism, it's more in the moral sense, like I said, in moral decisions, uh, the human moral interests will be above all other interests of all other aspects of nature. So, in the 1970s and 80s, there was a growing group of philosophers and scientists and thinkers who disagreed with these concepts, right? And I remember that the 1970s and 80s were a very happening time for for environmentalists. In fact, this was the time when many of the green groups that we know of today were formed, like, for example, Greenpeace. So one of these philosophers who challenged anthropocentrism at this time was American philosopher Paul W. Taylor, who wrote an essay called The Ethics of Respect for Nature. And in this essay, he argued for a life-centered system of environmental ethics over a human-centered one. So, life-centered here is essentially biocentrism, life-centered, right? So that is the second perspective that we'll be talking about. Now, how does he really argue for biocentrism? So Paul W. Taylor introduces three. I mean, he introduces many arguments, but three of these arguments we will be discussing today. The first thing he argues is that every single living being has a good of its own, regardless of its utility to other humans, or other organisms, right? This he called the good of a being. So every single organism is doing something that it needs to do for it to survive. So, for example, plants will grow towards the sunlight. Many plants will grow towards the sunlight because their growth and their survival depends on it. In the case of animals, a herd of elephants will move towards newer water bodies when the older water bodies which they were dependent on dry out, right? So that's something that they will do. And Paul Taylor argues that they deserve to do this. They should be let to do this. And why should they be let to do this? Because he said they have something known as inherent worth. Now, inherent worth has two branches. One is that they are deserving of moral consideration, and the second is that they have intrinsic value. So the first is deserving of moral consideration. And what does this mean? So what Taylor argues is that because these organisms are a part of Earth's living community, they deserve consideration from moral agents. Who are these moral agents? Humans. So what this means is that when we are deciding something, when something is right or wrong, the considerations of the goods of the other beings, other living beings, must also be considered when we are making decisions about what is right and what is wrong. Second is intrinsic value. And intrinsic value means that every living being is an end in itself and not a means to our use. So, what does this mean? For example, money is a means to comfort, whereas comfort is an end in itself, right? So, anthropocentric people would argue that, oh, well, trees are a means to wood, which we need, which has utility for us. So trees are here seen as a means to something, right? So what Paul Taylor argues that is that no, uh, trees and all other living beings have intrinsic value. They are an end in itself. And their value is not dependent on how useful they are to us, is what he says. So that is basically intrinsic value, according to Paul Taylor. Um and
But Nayantara, aren't these things widely accepted? I mean, like, what is exactly unique in this that it makes it so important?
Right. So, I mean, especially talking in the Indian scenario, like many of our, traditional beliefs actually say that, yes, every living being has a soul and must be protected and so on. But we need to, and it's pretty like many of us, especially in the, environmental, those who environmental discourse believe that, yes, living beings have intrinsic value, but what we need to remember is that uh, Paul W. Taylor put this out back in the 1980s, okay? And that was the time when anthropocentrism was way more dominant than it is today, right? These were new concepts for people back then. It was completely new. And people like Paul W. Taylor were the first to even suggest something like this, especially in the Western world, where anthropocentrism was the dominant point of view towards the nature. So, yes, and the last and the most interesting argument that Paul Taylor makes is the rejection of human superiority. So, like we saw under anthropocentrism, was the concept of human superiority. Um, Human moral superiority. And what Taylor did was to reject this concept. And he does so by first asking the anthropocentric, why are humans superior? So the common answers he got that were prevalent at that time, and some people even believe that today, is that okay, humans are rational animals. They are the most intelligent species. They have a conscience and are capable of making moral decisions. They are capable of pursuing higher interests like art and beauty and so on. So, I mean, these are skills that only humans have, abilities that only humans have. No other animal has this ability. So, naturally, humans are way above all other animals. So now Taylor responded by asking another question. Okay, we have all these skills and abilities, but who exactly are these abilities valuable to, right? Now let us go back to the point of a good of a being, right? Every being has a good of its own and is trying to do what it needs to survive. So birds need to fly, so they learn to fly. Leopards need to hunt, so they learn to hunt. Now, what if I say leopards also need to study physics so that they can understand the world, right? I mean, that is weird because the leopard has the studying physics has no survival value for the leopard, right?
Yeah, and that's so funny. I can't imagine leopard studying physics.
Yeah. So the point that Taylor's trying to make here is that this is not the good of a leopard, right? It has no survival value for the leopard. This has no survival value for any animal or any living being except the human. So, for example, fish do not need to understand the concepts of right and wrong. They need to learn how to use their fins to swim. And birds do not need to make scientific discoveries to expand their knowledge. They need to learn how to use their wings to fly. And cheetahs don't need to understand Vincent van Gogh's art and appreciate it. They just need to learn to run as fast as they can. The only living being, living species who even needs to do all these things, or these things have survival value for only one living being species, and that is the human being, right? So how bizarre would it be if birds thought that they are the most superior group of species on the planet because only they have the ability to fly, and humans are inferior because they don't have the ability to fly? That would be bizarre, right? So, are you getting Paul Taylor's point here? Humans considering themselves superior because of having abilities like rational thinking and intelligence is like engineers saying that they are the best professionals out there because only they have the skills to construct infrastructure and machines. Well, doctors, economists, and dancers don't need to uh, construct infrastructure and machines in order to perform their own professional roles, right? So that would be bizarre. And similarly, saying that humans are superior because of these abilities is also, not very logical according to Taylor. So it's mind blowing how Taylor destroys such an idea that was that was like the predominant view for millennia before him, and even is still is today, to a large extent. But at
Yes.
the same time, this life centered ethical framework or biocentrism is not free of problems, right? So by focusing on individual goods of a being, it largely ignores the interrelationship between individuals and species of two different species, and the relationship between living beings and abiotic elements of nature and so on. And also, what this would imply is that invasive species would also not, it would be wrong to eliminate invasive species, because even they are just, pursuing their own good and they have a right to do so, right? So we have a problem there. And
Yeah, and even like mosquitoes and other pests cannot be killed in that case, right?
exactly, mosquitoes, pests, and we even have a lantana, which is a non-native species of plant that grows in forests in South India. So there are so many invasive species that we know of which cannot be eliminated in according to this theory. So, alongside biocentrism, another view of environmental ethics was developing with a fundamentally different approach. And this started with Aldo Leopold, who was an American forester, ecologist, author, and philosopher. So, back in 1949, uh, his book, A Sand County Almanac, was published posthumously. And this book was basically, a set of reflections, his reflections on nature, and he just wrote about his philosophy of nature. And in this book, he introduces the concept of the land ethic. So land here is not literally the soil or earth. Land is basically everything that you find on any area of land. So it can be the biotic community, it can be the abiotic community, or the interrelationship between the two, and so on. So in modern terminology, it's what you would call ecosystem, right? So land here basically means an ecosystem. So Leopold says in this book that land as a community is the basic concept of ecology, but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. So basically, we know that land is a community because of ecology, but we know that land must be loved and respected because of ethics. So what you see here is philosophy coming in to complement science in environmental studies, or when we look at the environment, right? So he summarized his land ethic with the this principle: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So basically, anything that disturbs the integrity and stability of the ecosystems is actually wrong according to this environmental ethic. And so Leopold's land ethic was later developed into a more elaborate ethical theory, which came to be known as ecocentrism. So, how exactly is ecocentrism different from biocentrism? Well, the most important difference is that ecocentrism talks about abiotic as well as biotic species. So it takes a holistic approach, taking into account the relationships between different species and the sort of chain, the interlinked web of the entire ecosystem. Whereas biocentrism focuses on the intrinsic value of each individual being of a species. And conservationists or conservation scientists here would be reminded of the habitat based versus species based conservation debate. which so ecocentrism versus biocentrism is very similar to that. It is like the philosophical version of the habitat versus species based conservation. Um,
Yeah, so uh, keep. I would like to remind everybody on the live chat to keep thinking about those two questions. I see a lot
yeah,
of comments already coming in, and people, putting their thought out. They've started thinking, so that's a good news.
yeah.
But just reminding, because we will be talking about the questions in the end. So just a reminder, guys, keep thinking and keep your comments coming in. I'm loving it.
Right. So with that, we move on to like, so these were the three main perspectives that we have under environmental ethics. And with that, I would just like to touch upon a few other perspectives that are important and must be definitely mentioned. So the first of these is deep ecology. So deep ecology is a very unique perspective towards the environment, and one of the very different, distinct contributions of philosophy to environmental studies. So, deep ecology was formulated by Arne Nies, a Norwegian philosopher in 1973. Now, deep ecology was what Nies called was a reaction to what Nies called shallow ecology, right? So, shallow, like to put it very simply, what he defined as shallow ecology was is very similar to the anthropocentric environmentalism that we saw in the first few slides, right? So, he was against this, and he advocated instead for deep ecology, which was more in line with anti-anthropocentric principles, like we are all part of the same community. um, and yeah, so how is deep ecology different from ecocentrism, biocentrism? So the main difference is that Arne Nies described deep ecology as an ecosophy, which is basically an ecological philosophy. So so instead of it being an academic or theoretical perspective like the previous two were, this was more like a philosophy, a way of life that people could incorporate based on the principles of deep ecology. Uh, the next perspective that we will see is ecofeminism. Now, ecofeminism is another very interesting philosophical perspective and forms a part of social ecology, which draws a connection between social structures and social systems and environmental issues. So, in particular, what ecofeminists argue is that there is a glaring similarity between how human society has historically treated the environment and how human society has historically treated women. So they say that what anthropocentrism is to the environment, which is based on human dominion over nature, patriarchy is to women, which is based on the social and political domination of men over women. And so if we go back to this image that was displayed under anthropocentrism, we see that there are two human figures here, right? And the one at the top is the figure of a man, and there is a figure which looks like the one of the woman below the man, right? So in reality, this is not just human superiority; it's the superiority of men that is in question here. So how does this work? So ecofeminists argue that the way we approach environmentalism and the way we approach feminism, the way we approach feminist principles must be allied and connected, right? The way we treat the environment and the way we treat the women must change simultaneously together. It is a movement that must happen together, and only then will we achieve, true. The true sense of the living community that we talk of in deep ecology or ecocentrism or biocentrism, right? So many of you may know about this lady here, Vandana Shiva, who many of you may know of her as an environmentalist. but she is also one of the very great Indian eco-feminist and very well known throughout the world as an eco-feminist. And she has even published a few works on her views on ecofeminism. So that's something that we must all know about. Um, and I would like to end this list with the mention of another very great Indian philosopher named Jiddu Krishnamurti. Now, Krishnamurti has been known as one of the very unique Indian philosophers because of his distinct philosophy, which set him apart from all other, Indian lines of thought. So for Krishnamurti, nature must be experienced for it to be valued, right? So um, we instead of having a dominion over nature, we must have communion with nature, right? We must understand nature, not in the scientific sense, but in the personal sense. We must understand what does nature mean to me, right? We must develop this personal connection with nature and then feel a sense of belonging towards it. And what's really amazing is that he has, based on this principle, he has developed an entire education curriculum for children. And a wonderful thing happened today, that in one of the earlier sessions about organic farming, we were talking with Ms. Deepa More, and she works at the Sayadri School in Pune, which is actually one of the Krishnamurti Foundation India schools throughout the country. So it was really good. If any of you attended that session, you must have heard of the accounts of the students at Sayadri School. You know how they are made they're encouraged to do farming, uh, organic farming, that too, harvestation, and so many other things. Students are encouraged to learn about birds and do bird watching, and they have outdoor classes and so on. And there are so many things. So the entire education curriculum of these schools, we have a school in Pune, one near Bangalore. The main one is in Chittoor district in Andhra Pradesh. And you have 6 schools like these throughout the country, which are based on this philosophy of Jiddu Krishnamurti, based on communion with nature. So that's something really amazing that we must think about, how we can incorporate environmental philosophy with education and try to encourage children to get into that, from their early childhood. So with that, I bring you, yes, that is a portrait of Jiddu Krishnamurti in his early days. And with that, I bring you back to our questions. So what answers do you have now? And could you identify which perspective your answer aligns with? And why do you think that answer is right for you? And also, why do you think this is important? And finally, have you learned something new today? So with that, I would like to end the presentation. And before I do so, I like to thank Fridays for Future India and Jasmine for being the host.
Hey, my pleasure, Nayantara. It's always good to hear you talk about philosophy. I can just listen to you every day. Okay, so let's. So we open the session live stream for discussion. Please use the comment section to interact. I'm watching it, so um, also I'll just read out a few ones which I noticed. Um, so. Someone says that there are two perspectives. One, if we consider Western educated guys travel all around the world, they will consider themselves to be superior. Two, now consider tribals, for them lion is superior. So I guess he's thinking out loud and he's trying to add his perspective to what we were talking here. Before I get to the other thoughts here, Nayantara, would you like to tell why people's answer to these two questions or those questions are important?
Right. So, well, first of all, these questions, like you mentioned, they are not hypothetical thought experiments or hypothetical situations. These are very much real life situations. And this is something that many of us are actually fighting against or for, right? Be it deforestation or habitat loss or sort of harming animals and so on. So we are actively participating in this, right? So what is useful always is to sort of step back and think, why am I doing this? Not because you're wrong or anything, but it's always important to know where you're coming from, right? It's always important to know why, what are your values, which value of yours has led to this passion for fighting for this. And so
Yes.
what is it that drives you? So when you look at such questions and when you try to answer them, you actually discover this. You discover your values. You discover what is it that you value, because of which you think this is right or wrong. And that is very important, not only for your personal growth, but for you to understand your actions.
Yes. I definitely feel a sense of thinking through these questions. So we have one comment here. She brings out an interesting thought here. Hamza, he brings out Hamza Murli. He says an interesting parallel would be the evolution of dogs, bonding with humans and pleasing them because of value to their survival. I could never think of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's
Yeah,
interesting, right? Yeah.
really.
So then there's one thought on the school philosophy that you were sharing, anthropocentrism. Uh, Vishwajit Sahu says, um, is anthropocentrism the default belief system of humans? Is it so because we have no certain way? Is it so because we have no certain way to know that animals can philosophize?
Okay, interesting. Um, so, like, okay, again, anthropocentrism as a philosophy is not as straightforward as saying that, okay, what uh, sort of like what is important for my survival is what is the most important value, because anthropocentrism is a philosophical perspective, right? So the origins lie in philosophy. So when you look at these philosophical perspectives, you can find traces of them in religion and culture, right? So I would say that it is not really like a natural thing, but rather how the culture in which you're brought up, right? So when you have forest communities, they may be brought up in a culture in which they actually treat the natural world as having intrinsic value, and that would determine their lifelong perspective on the environment, right? Whereas anthropocentrism is like it's the philosophical belief that humans are superior, and this is morally superior. This is not about is it going to help in my like is it dependent? What am I dependent on for my survival? It's about the moral superiority, thinking that I am morally superior. My moral interests are like the most important here, and that's not something that comes from just natural survival instinct, but something that comes from belief, is what I think.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts coming in here. And plus we have press on time,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
always.
yeah.
So we have 6 minutes. So I would ask you two more questions if we can fit in. So why can't we just take all the good parts of from all the theories and solve problems? Like, wouldn't we? Like, what are your thoughts? Is it possible? Like,
Right.
what?
So I think I would like to remind all of you of the first, I think, second slide, where I talked about how you first like look at words and define them, then you make arguments around them, and then you make theories and so on. So that's how philosophy works, right? Now, when you look at it in terms of that, you have anthropocentrism, which is a theory. You must realize that any argument given in anthropocentrism is actually connected with the argument that came before it, and so on. So, in every philosophical theory, you can't look at arguments in isolation, right? You have to look at the entire philosophical theory in itself. Like, for example, you may say that, okay, why not? We can just convince everyone to care about the planet because their survival depends on it. That's cool. Okay, that's cool. But then if you're doing it from the anthropocentric perspective, then you're also automatically subscribing to the principle that humans are superior and that you must think of humans first or think of you first as a human. So, like I said, if we are taking anthropocentric beliefs, we have to also realize that that particular belief is connected to the basic principle, which is human superiority.
Mm, interesting. But it does create a few ethical dilemmas, and people on the chat agree to that. Okay, so last question, guys. So people are thinking a lot on the chat. I'm going to share that with you,
Okay.
and I guess we should do this more often. My last question would be, why is philosophy important for environmentalists?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, first of all, we have everything that I presented, right? The knowledge of all these theories. Okay, that is important. But apart from that, there are three things that really help uh, from the side of philosophy. It would really help all environmentalists. The first is that philosophy gives you clarity of thought. It helps you understand your own beliefs, right? So when you're engaging in philosophy, you're basically engaging with arguments, and these arguments help you to see where your views fit in, and whether if you agree with an argument, then you know why you agree with it, and if you don't, then you start thinking about, okay, why do I not agree with it, right? So it gives you clarity of thought and you understand yourself better, right? So and the second thing is that it also helps you to justify yourself to or your views to others. So one major problem that all environmentalists share is to convince people, like, hey, all of this matters, we're doing this for a reason. So how do you convince people? Through arguments, right? Through argumentation and discourse. And what teaches you the art of argumentation and discourse? It is philosophy. So philosophy will teach you how to present your thoughts, to articulate your beliefs in order to justify them, and in order to convince people why all of this matters, and convince people about your perspective. And finally, the most important thing that only philosophy has given me personally is the realization about the importance of um, uh, compatibility of beliefs, right? So, what this means is that uh, the beliefs, many a times, the beliefs that we have are actually incompatible with each other. So if suppose I believe that I believe in biocentrism, I believe that all animals have intrinsic value, but then I move on to, like, say that it's okay to for me to eat meat, which is basically comes from killing animals, right? So how does this is incompatible, right? And you can't have both of these beliefs together and just move on with your life. So philosophy will show you how there are these really subtle incompatibilities between your beliefs, and how it will aid you in sort of resolving those incompatibilities, and again they give you more and more clarity of thought. So that are three things that philosophy alone can really develop in you and help you with environmentalism.
Thank you for sharing that. So we have just 1 minute left. So I'll quickly thank you from on behalf of Fridays for Future, and from all the audience. We have a lot of people watching us on the live stream. I think we all enjoyed listening to you, and the work that you presented of all this good work. We are definitely thinking a lot. And I will pass it to you for thank you note. But in your thank you note, can you also mention where can people find you on social media?
Jasmine, you got cut off. You got cut off, Jasmine. I couldn't hear
Where
what you
was
asked.
I'm passing you the
Again, couldn't hear you. Could you?
Okay, so poor connection. Sorry for the glitches. I want you to give a closing thought, and I want you
Yeah.
to mention, resources where people can
Right, right,
read and learn more about
right, right,
environmental
right.
ethics. Yeah, and
Right.
thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I would like to thank Fridays for Future India for giving me the opportunity to present something that is not talked about very often. And I would like to thank Jasmine for being such a wonderful host and everyone else who helped me with this. And thank you everyone for being a part of this live stream, for showing interest in something that is, like I said, not a very rare and not talked about. And yeah, talking about resources, I think if you like to begin with environmental ethics, you could look at websites like Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So these are very basic compilations of, these will have compilations of environmental ethics. So you could just Google that with these names. And also, one more amazing thing you can do is to actually read the works that I mentioned to start with, like, for example, a Sand County Almanac or the essay, The Ethics of Respect for Nature. These are all not very advanced that you will not be able to understand it. So definitely go ahead, read these, and you will enjoy the read. So yeah, with that, I would like to end
It's time to go,
on
and
this
we
note.
have thank you. We have people thanking you from the YouTube comment section for talking your passion.
So
Okay, all
thank
right.
you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Nayantara. Thank you, everyone, and yeah, have a nice day and happy Environment Day again.
Bye bye.
Bye.